I want to introduce our new weight loss program we're promoting here at the museum. This fellow used to weigh 250 pounds, and he's just trimmed right down to, that's Yorick. I'd like to kind of bring you up to date. We're going to talk about the latest fossils. We're not going to go back and look at a bunch of old disgraced Hesperopithecus, that kind of thing. I want to talk about what's going on right now in science and nature. And how do we come up? How do evolutionists come up with Apeman? Well, let's begin with Scripture. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? We ought to start there always. And Psalm 100, one of the great creation psalms, verse 3 says, "Know that the Lord, He is God. It's He who has made us and not we ourselves." Well, that's pretty obvious to me. He made us, not we ourselves. People say, well, what about having babies? Isn't that sort of like creating, giving birth to a baby? No, we call that procreation. That's different than creation. All the genetic information is there from the get-go. In fact, that individual was known before the worlds were formed, called according to his purpose. Now, as so often in the case of the Psalms, as you know, they don't rhyme, and that's great because that means the poetry works in any language, including English. It wouldn't work if you had to depend on rhyming. And so it often like juxtaposes ideas, gives the antithesis or something that emphasizes the previous statement. So it's the Lord that's made us, not we ourselves. I can put a therefore in here. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. We're accountable to Him. And that's what chases a lot of people away, and I don't blame them. A lot of the folks, just about everybody I worked with over the years at Washington University School of Medicine, Stanford University Medical School, Woods Hole Marine Biology Laboratory, the fear that a God would stand in judgment of them drives them away. And if they don't know that the Creator is also the Savior, you're never going to talk them out of it with science. I guarantee. I'm 74. I haven't done it. I don't think you will either. You can sit and argue with an evolutionist. You know who wins? 3 days later, he asks, who's still standing? It just goes on and on. There's no end to it. So the Bible's pretty clear about that. And if we go to the New Testament, Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5, here Jesus was asked about divorce. I'm not going to get into that. But as his answer, it said, he answered him and said, "Have you not read?" Modern translation would go like, haven't you folks read your Bibles? Because if they did, they wouldn't have even needed to ask the question they asked. But the Lord is long-suffering. He chastises them a bit for not reading their Bibles and then goes on to give them the explanation they asked for. He who created them from the beginning. When? From the beginning. Now let me just give you, oftentimes evolutionists like to take some unit of length like this plastic femur here, maybe use a yardstick or meter stick, and they try to show you where the different events in cosmic history have happened, when life came on the scene here, what have you. And out of 14 billion years, according to evolution, that's the whole cosmic history, about 4.5 billion years of Earth history, according to evolutionists. I don't believe any of this stuff. But when would humans come along? If this length represented the history of the cosmos. What you do is you get a little oil from your forehead, and you touch it right here. And that oil film is when human beings came on the scene. And then religion. It came much later. Primitive man had to invent religion. My kids learned about that in social studies class. How primitive man invented religion, which ultimately led to Christianity, New Age, whatever. It's all comparable, according to the social studies teacher. So in the beginning, right from the get-go, He made a male and female and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. I have a prediction to make. If we ever get to a place in America where we ignore this scripture, which is right out of Genesis, the first 3 chapters, if we ever get to a point where we mythologize this, allegorize it, or just dismiss it as pre-scientific, why, I'll bet nearly half of all marriages will end in divorce. I'll bet we'll lose sight of what even constitutes a marriage. Is it between one man and one woman, or 2 of this and 3 of that? Or, why 1 and 1? Why not 2 and 5, or 12 and 24? And then, of course, we don't stop with human beings. Eventually, we'll have bestiality and everything else. Wait a minute. That's not a prediction. We're already there. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. This is the whole basis of marriage. You throw out those first 3 chapters of Genesis, and you do not have a sustainable position to argue for marriage between one man and one woman. Then you're off into the natural world talking about, well, it works better that way, you can have offspring. Then you start arguing with the atheists, and the last one standing wins. Here's what an evolutionist has to say about evolution and the origin of man. This is Julian Huxley. I quoted it in my previous talk. He's one of the biggest names in evolution. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there's no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all of the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, our mind and our soul, as well as our brain and body, and so did religion. And I think some people like to hold something up high and dry out of it. We'll accept all this evolution, I just want to pull man out of this. Or we'll let man evolve too, but I want to pull the Bible out, Christianity out, I want to have that up above here. No, the whole package. The whole package is everything evolves, including your Christianity, including religion. It's a big package to buy into. Well, I'll tell you, there are times in life, you get to be my age, you have what we call maturity moments. And I read things that are so crazy, I think the author could not possibly have said this. And I want to give you an example, and I'd like maybe a little vote of confidence if, in fact, I do understand this correctly. Got this out of a biology book several years ago. I neglected to put down the particular book, but it was there. And they had this drawing, or woodcut, by Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, popularized evolution in Germany. And the author of the biology book said this was one of the first attempts to deal with the specifics of evolution. He starts in the upper left-hand corner with, I don't know if that's supposed to represent a cell or a blob, a cytoplasm or what, goes on to form multicellular creatures, tunicates, worms. Finally, we get to fish, we get to amphibians, we get to reptiles, we get to marsupials, mammals, vertebrates, and finally we end up down here at step 24 with the Papua tribesman from New Guinea representing humankind. So there it is in 24 steps, the specifics of evolution. Now, it's the next thing the author said that I need a little help on. Is this as crazy as I think it is, or am I missing something? This is what the author said in the next step. Although this genealogical chart, starting with the blob of protoplasm and continuing to modern Papua, although this chart is filled with misconceptions and fictitious creatures, it's fairly accurate. Oh, good. I thought I was going crazy. It couldn't be this bad. It's got to be me. I mean, it can't be this bad. But it is. It is this bad. But finish the sentence. He said it's fairly accurate considering the dearth of knowledge in his day. What does dearth mean? Lack. In other words, fairly accurate considering they didn't know anything. The question is not what were they saying back then, but what's the evidence today? Let's look into that a bit. This is Richard Lowenton, formerly at Harvard University. He wrote a book called Human Diversity. He was a self-professed atheist, evolutionist, and Marxist. We had the whole package going. You can survive well at Harvard with that combination. So anyway, Richard Lowenton said this, and I agree with him completely. See, I don't always disagree with the evolution. There are times when I'm on base with him. He said, despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, that's people who study fossils, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. Now that's interesting. We ought to publish that on the bulletin boards of all the biology classes in America. What does the word hominid mean? Nowadays they use the word hominin instead of hominid. Some evolutionists say it means the same thing. Others say no, it means something different. It gets confusing out there. You need a scorecard to keep up. Hominid, as used here, meant all of the known ape-like ancestors of man that walked upright on 2 legs. Now, I don't mean just occasionally upright on 2 legs, and I don't mean waddling like an ape. I mean like this, absolutely human. And so all of the non-humans that walk that way, and humans themselves, and collateral relatives. These are creatures that were on their way to becoming human, but for some reason or another became extinct and didn't make the whole trip, called collateral relatives. So all of these are hominids. I would say the only known hominid is human being by that particular definition. Now, here's the nature of the problem. This is summarizing very superficially, but the principles here of what evolutionists believe about human evolution. They believe that humans up here in the present and apes that live today, this is present, 5 million years ago shared a common ancestry. It was called an ape-like creature. Now, they hate it if you say man evolved from apes. They want you to say man evolved from ape-like creatures. Okay to say man evolved from reptiles or amphibians or fish, but when it gets to the ancestors of man, they want ape-like. That makes sense, because if you said apes, then you'd say apes evolved into apes. How are you doing with that? In fact, even ape-like. How many are prepared to believe that apes come from ape-like creatures? How many would sign on to chickens come from chicken-like creatures and ducks come from duck-like? You're okay with that, okay? Okay, so you can see the problem they have. The dotted lines simply mean, you see it all the time in these charts, it means that these are inferences. This is not hard data. And they oftentimes even put question marks in if you don't follow the dotted lines. So you'll notice that the trip from ape to modern apes rarely has anything in it at all. It's almost as if we've told the apes, if you're interested in your evolution, figure it out for yourself. We're working on humans. Now, here are some of the cast of characters. We can put a lot more in, but this is the basics we're talking here now. Australopithecus remitis, I'll be talking about that later. They've changed the name to Ardipithecus remitis. Once again, you got to stay on your toes to keep up with the changing terminology. This is the most famous fossil of all. If I were to ask you, name an ape man or ape woman, how many come up with Lucy? Most of you would, rather than some of the other oddballs out there. The other fossil, so-called fossil humans. So that's Lucy. Lucy's huge. Lucy gave rise to Australopithecus africanus, shown standing with a military posture like this, Marine drill sergeant. I mean, this is sad. We got apes walking like that. I go through life walking like this. Is this fair? So anyway, Africanus was on its way, but became extinct and didn't go any further. So that's one of the collateral relatives we're talking about. And then Lucy gave rise to Homo, which is our genus. And modern man, Homo sapiens, came on the scene 200,000 years ago. How many species of humans do we have? One. How many subspecies do we have? We have one. We're called Homo sapiens sapiens. That means we are one sharp cookie. We are one sharp cookie. Sapiens means wise, okay? So, man alive, there are very few creatures on Earth where you can say there's only one species, only one subspecies, because they're all alone. Most creatures, you have all kinds of, there are 13 different subspecies of red fox alone. So human beings, we're it. It's almost like we share a common ancestor at some point in history, huh? Male and a female. I mean, you'd think that, wouldn't you? So 200,000 years ago, man comes on the scene as full-blown Homo sapiens. I'm now going to give you an anatomy lesson. This could get a little boring, but I'll try to spice it up for you a little bit here anyway. What is the difference between an ape and a human? It's no good talking about evidence for ape men if you don't know the difference between an ape and a human. I believe God made apes, he made humans, he just didn't make ape humans. So that means whenever we look at a fossil that's supposed to be an ape man, if you know what to look for, you ought to be able to quickly tell whether it's a human or an ape. Now, if I say anything that is not absolutely obvious, I want you to raise your hand and have me go through it again, okay? The first difference between an ape and a human that I've listed here are the nasal bones. On an ape, the nasal bones are flat. This is a chimpanzee, supposed to be the closest living relative to man. You see how flat that is? The only thing that protrudes is soft tissue. Want to do an interesting experiment, go to the zoo, get permission to go into the gorilla cage, go up to the largest male gorilla, grab a hold of his schnoz, you can push it all over his face. The problem is they get testy. But notice this is flat. You cannot break an ape's nose. There's nothing to break. Now, there are two bones that make up what we call the nasal bones. They're kind of triangular. In a human, they're like a pup tent, like this, see? But an ape, they're like a collapsed pup tent. Same bones, homology is real, both have nasal bone. Here's a human. In fact, I have an interesting way to tell whether a creature is an ape or not. by simply establishing that apes can't wear glasses. You see, you put glasses on the skull, forget about the ears, skulls don't have ears. But you see how it slides down the nose here? There's nothing to hold these glasses. Man alive, you put it on a human, it just sits in there like that, huh? So the nasal bones, as you can see here, protrude on the human. There's also a nasal spine. You can feel it under here. And that's what you break if you break your nose. The rest is all cartilage and soft tissue. So you can tell right away, if that's the only evidence you had, you could pick out the apes from the humans that fast. But I believe in being more thorough. The next one is apes have a slope face and humans have a vertical face. Let's just examine that. Here's our ape. We call this a sloped face. This is like, duh. Somebody said, yeah, but what if you hold it like that, then it's vertical? No, you go by the cheekbones, the zygomatic arch you feel right here. If those cheekbones are parallel with the table or the floor, that's about the way the head is carried in the body. And then it's the slope of the face compared to the cheekbone. Now compare that to a human. And again, if this is not like duh, obvious, raise your hand, we'll go through it again. Here's a human, got the cheekbones parallel with the table, and the face is vertical. If this is all you knew, believe me, you could sort out the apes from the humans that fast. A 5-year-old could. In fact, I have 5-year-olds in the class. Sometimes they get it just fine. So anyway, that's sloped versus vertical face. The next one is the forehead. The forehead of the ape is flat, and that of the human is curved, and that impacts on the orbit of the eye, making the orbit of the eye of the ape hard to see from the side. The human is quite visible. This is a human. The forehead is curved. I've heard that this is an adaptation so Norwegians can go oofta, but it may not be true. But see how it's curved? Because it's curved, you can look right into the orbits from the side. Surgeons can get all the way behind the eye, in fact, even pull the eye out a ways, without cutting any bone. That's because the face is curved. Take a look at any ape. I don't care. Pick one. This is a chimp. Barely see that it has orbits from the side because it's flat. This bone comes way out to the edge here. See that? Is this stuff all just completely obvious to you? It should be very straightforward. The last one, apes have a small cranial capacity. Humans have a large one, relatively speaking. What are we talking about? Apes, rarely larger than 400 or 500 cc's up here. And humans average about 1,500 cc's. Pygmy or something could go as low as 700 or so, 800. By the way, size of brain has nothing to do with intelligence within a species, as long as it's in the normal range. You want proof that nobody will argue with? On average, women have a brain 100 cc's smaller than men. That ought to lay to rest any notion that it has correlation to intelligence. What is it correlating to? Well, on average, women are probably that percentage smaller than males. So it reflects body size. Big people have big brains and little people have little brains. Are big people automatically smarter than little people? Of course not. And when you compare between creatures, between different species and what have you, then, of course, there's no comparison. For example, an elephant has a much larger brain than we do, but they're not that much smarter. So you're ready for the test. Oh, yeah, there's always got to be a test. You know, we teachers don't get paid a whole lot, and one of the few joys we have in life is persecuting students with exams. So here it is. I expect a perfect score out of all of you, and I'm going to give you 1/2 second to answer. This is Australopithecus sediba. It's one of the recent heartthrobs in evolution. This particular creature was filled 2 entire issues of Science magazine. Also Nature. I mean, this is huge. The issues were sent out to high schools all over America to crush creationist opposition. Let's just apply your knowledge that we've just taught here. You get a chance to use it now. What about the nasal bones? This is a human. This is sediba. Are they protruding on sediba compared to the human? No, therefore it looks like what? An ape, that's what everybody says. What about the slope of the face? Give you a little help here, outlining. Looks like I mean, how difficult is this? You could teach this in school. I have. I've taught it in high school classes, and I get letters. They've just flipped out. They can't believe they've been given an opportunity to think. I invite them to disagree with me. It's obvious. I don't think I'd ever even teach this in most schools. So it looks like an ape, of course. What about the visibility of the orbits? This versus this. Sediba looks like an ape. And finally, cranial capacity. 400 cc's versus 1,500 looks like an ape. Yeah, what's your conclusion? It is an ape. This is not difficult. So we've pretty well settled it for Sediba, haven't we? But wait! Remember that advertisement? But wait! Sediba has been reworked a bit. First of all, they wanted to get rid of the technical name. Nobody could remember it. They wanted to give it a name like Lucy or something that was catch on. So they had a competition for young people to name Sediba. And the name that won was Carabo, which means the link. Apparently it's, I don't know, Afrikaner or something like that. The Mail Online is the online version of the London Daily Mail, which is the second largest newspaper in the UK. And they had an article that reveals what science is all about when you're in the field of evolution. You're going to see science at work here in behalf of evolution. This is going to prick your interest, I'm sure. A smile from 2 million years ago. That's amazing. They found a 2 million-year-old smile. Are you kind of interested in what it was they found? Revealed. Oh, it's actually been revealed. This is not guesswork. It was revealed on the face of the missing link between ape and man. Well, let's look into this. Let's look at the new Sediba that's been groomed for popular consumption. Love those ham bones. It says, meet Carabo, probably our earliest ancestor and the missing link between man and ape, seen for the first time thanks to this incredible portrait. They had somebody paint a picture. They said, put some ham bones on this, and I mean, it gets worse. It says, a curious smile playing on his face. What on earth would a fossilized smile look like? What would make it up? There are no bones in the lips, so no lip bones. How do they know it was smiling? Well, it was smiling on the portrait because the artist was told, would you like to be paid? He said, yeah, put a smile on it. A curious smile playing on his face. I love this next part. The eyes and the mouth are unmistakably human. Yeah, you got that right. They put a white sclera. There are no apes or monkeys with a white sclera. They all have a dark brown sclera. All you got to do is put the whites in the eyes, and people look at it and think, I don't know what it is about this ape, but there's something eerily human about it. Do you think they found, do you have any idea how poor the fossil record is for scleral color? Nada. But the artist wanting to be paid, and the smile, I mean, they just kind of put a little smile on it. And I love the ham bones, and it obviously gets regular haircuts to keep that well trimmed. It gets worse than this. It's a more human-like nose than we've seen before. He's just wrinkling it because he's smiling. Chimps can't smile. There's your hard data for you. They found a smile on Carabo, and I think you'll all agree, chimps can't smile. I don't know how much more evidence you would want to believe in evolution. Well, let's get on with our test. This is Australopithecus remitis, or Ardipithecus remitis, as it's called now. Remember, it was on the chart, one of the early ones. Just take a look at it. Is it a human or an ape? 300 cc, can't see in the orbits, slope face. I mean, this is duh. It's an ape. Of course, it's an ape. We don't even have to talk about this. This is Paranthropus boisei. Does it look like an ape or human? It's an ape, no question about it. Here's Cro-Magnon man. Does the nose protrude? Are the orbits cut back? Is it a large cranial capacity, actually about 100 or 2 cc's larger than average for humans? Is the face vertical relative to the zygomatic arch, part of which is missing right in here? When you look at all those questions, what's your answer? Does it look like a human or look like an ape? This is not difficult stuff. This could be taught in our schools. Probably be jailed for it, but it could be taught. But 3 ways to make an ape man. This exhausts all the possibilities. If anyone can think of a 4th way, drop by, I'll add it. Okay? One way is combine parts from apes and humans. So you find ape fossils, human fossils, you put them together, declare them to be one specimen. So that's one way. What's the second way? Downscale humans. So if you find humans in the fossil record, try to find something about them that you can say they're really not quite human. That makes an ape man, right? And finally, the third should be obvious by now, upscale apes. Find apes and then find something about it. You could argue, it's a little human-like. The smile might be more human-like. The whites of the eyes might be more human-like. Well, what about combining humans and apes? It happened with Piltdown Man. I believe he's carving the neck of a Stradivarius here, I'm not sure. He was discovered in 1912. Hey, that's an interesting date. 1925 was the Scopes trial. We've got a whole DVD on it. Blow your socks off if you're not familiar with the Scopes trial. If everything you've ever heard or read about the Scopes trial, particularly in the movie Inherit the Wind, if you assume everything is precisely opposite of the truth, you'll be right most of the time, and I established that with the actual trial transcript. I was the first person to write an article, a lengthy article on the Scopes trial. It actually went through the trial transcript, paragraph by paragraph. 1912, so 1925, this was the evidence for the origin of man. It was Piltdown Man, confidently dated at 300,000 years old. Anyone who doubted that would have been declared anti-science. What was the fossil evidence? It was a human skull combined with an orangutan mandible, molars from a chimp, orangutan mandible and molars, and a chimp canine tooth. And this fooled the scientific community for 40 years. It's said that there were many theologians who abandoned all notion that God created man specially, but rather created beasts which became humans because of this evidence. And 40 years later, they found out it was a hoax. Somebody who must have been a professional evolutionist did it because they knew what evolutionists were looking for, and they fed it to them. What they did is they kind of salted the Piltdown quarry. I visited. It's not far from Darwin's home outside of London in England. And here is the skull. The brown is what they found. The white is interpreted. If you look at the trajectory here, this is a large cranial capacity, certainly out of the range of any ape or monkey. Oddly enough, they found the nasal bones, and they protrude. Given the vault of the skull and nasal bones, you obviously have a human here. But the mandible isn't quite right. And the reason it isn't quite right is the hoaxer took a mandible from a female orangutan, just happened to have one with me. This mandible was donated to Piltdown Man. It was a modern orangutan, so they stained it up to kind of look like the skull. The skull is believed to come from somebody back in the 13 or 1400s, the plagues that went through England. They had so many bodies, they couldn't even bury them in London. They took them out to quarries. So that's possibly the origin of the skull. But it was a modern, today type orangutan. The teeth had obviously been filed to get them down to the size more consistent with a human. And then they didn't have the canine at first. And I don't know if like the evolutionists have a god of their own or what, but they really wished they had a canine. And a canine tooth appeared in the quarry miraculously at the feet of the Roman Catholic priest Teilhard de Chardin. So anyway, they put the whole thing together. Problem was, whoever did the hoax, remember, they used a canine from a chimp, so this is a chimp, it would be this tooth right here. And it's so pointy and long that nobody'd ever assume that had anything to do with a human. So the hoaxer filed it down, file, but he filed too far, filed into the pulp chamber. So now you got a hole going in there. Then took a piece of bone, cut it to shape, plugged it in the hole, sanded it off, so you got a plugged tooth. Easy to see the plug in the tooth. Now, any critical scientist looking at this plugged tooth could come to one of two conclusions. This is it. It exhausts all possibilities. One, this is a hoax. Two, this is the world's first root canal. So there's your choice. Well, mercifully, that one was laid to rest. There's probably a lot of mixtures of human and ape parts. After all, a lot of these fossils are found over 2, 3, 4 years and scattered all over the place. Who knows what you're getting together? Making apes out of humans. That happened with Neanderthal man. You probably heard of Neanderthal man. This is the way he was painted originally. Boy, isn't he, how would you like to run into him in the dark? Hey, and his wife is no sweetheart either over here. And for that matter, the kids are pretty ugly. This is really they had a statue of Neanderthal man, the husband and wife, presumably, or male and female, at the entrance of the Field Museum in Chicago. And it was so frightening. They said when the kids would come through on field trips, they would run to get past this. Well, it was later found the whole thing was a complete misrepresentation of what the fossil looks like. We have hundreds of fossils of Neanderthal man today. We have every single bone in the body, including the hyoid bone up here in the neck, which is hooked up to some muscles that go are involved in speech and what have you. So anyway, that's the way it was portrayed. What is reality? Here are the actual skeleton. Is the actual skeleton of Neanderthal man. I can tell you as a human anatomist, absolutely human, no question about it. Now, is there anything distinctive? Oh, yes. But there's distinctive features in Australian Aboriginals, in Asians, in Nordics, in Eskimos. You can sort them all out. I had a colleague at Washington University School of Medicine, much older than I, who after the Second World War was involved in the body repatriation program, and they would go to battlefields and sort out the bodies as to nationality and try to restore them. And they got very good at it. So yeah, there's some idiosyncrasies. Skull has a bit of a bun on the back. The mandible's quite large, always had room for its third molars, the wisdom teeth, and even had a retromolar space behind that. But absolutely human. They had a fellow by the name of Jay Materns, who's an expert at taking a skeleton like from a murder victim and calculating how deep the flesh would be and then covering it over. And he's been good enough at it to actually produce a recognizable human being from the skeleton to show who the murder victim was. Well, they had Jay Mattern work on Neanderthal man. And from the neck on down, I mean, absolutely human, no difference whatever. The head, the brow ridges are a bit pronounced. And the ears and nose are quite big. But you know, he was told to make the big ears and nose because it was turning out to be like way too human. And so they put a really good honker on him. So, you know, the bone is back here, but the flare, you can do pretty much what you want. And the ears, you know, I could tell you, hey, this is a plastic skeleton, but let's say it were real. I knew this person when he was alive. I mean, the ears were like this. You could say, I'm not sure I believe that, you know, but could you prove me wrong? Oh, you should have seen the nose. It was out here. You see, you can play games with certain parts, and indeed the poor artist does what he's told to do, or she, as the case may be. People say, yeah, but what about this brow ridge? I mean, that definitely was there. Here's Neanderthal man right here, and a brow ridge of the torus. Now, as I look around, I see people where the light hits. Some have a bit of a brow ridge, some don't. Australian Aboriginals come close to this, 100% human, of course. But what about the brow ridge? Well, it's not just adults that have been reconstructed from the bones. Children. Here's about a 13-year-old girl that was reconstructed based on the bones. And if this little gal were sitting in the audience today, we'd probably tell her that her clothes are a bit shabby. She should have dressed up a bit and maybe run a comb through the hair. Other than that, cute little girl. In fact, the only thing I can see on this little girl that would even make me look twice, the lips are a little full. But there are no lip bones. I mean, they had to do something. You just can't let this be a 13-year-old girl. It looks like anyone you see walking down the street. Also, where's the torus? The children didn't have a torus. It appears to develop with age, possibly great age. We believe these individuals were humans who survived or lived after the flood. And things must have been rough. They lived in caves anywhere they could find a place. I was in Grand Canyon once. They told me it never rained, so I didn't bring a shelter with me. I got down to the bottom and it rained. So don't let anybody tell you it doesn't rain in Grand Canyon in the bottom. And I crawled into a cave to get out of the rain. Scorpions and all. I was bats. I was in the cave. So I mean, you get what's available. And these were big, robust people that obviously lived a tough life. In fact, Neanderthals not only made tools, they made musical instruments. One burial site had a couple of flutes with holes and positions to be playable. They buried their people in certain ritual positions. You know, you never see a monkey or an ape carefully arranging the body for burial. And what's really amazing is they engaged in some medical and surgical procedures. For example, we've found many Neanderthals who have evidence of broken bones that have healed straight. They had to put some kind of a splint on it. What's really amazing is they find Neanderthals where there's been an amputation, and the person obviously survived it because the bone is healed over smoothly. It's not just a jagged end. They had to stop the bleeding, stitch it up, presumably fight infection somehow. I don't know if you've ever seen an ape do an amputation, but it's a grisly sight. It's, so 100% human. Everybody on board with that? I mean, do all the criteria, vertical face, orbits cut back on the side, protruding nasal bone, and we have hundreds of these specimens, almost every continent. This is a big one. This is what you see a lot. And the most common is Australopithecus. Australo means southern. Like Ken says, he's from the deep south, Australia. And Pithecus means ape. I got a question for you. Whatever else we can say about Australopithecus, it is an ape. Evolutionists themselves call it an ape, Pithecus. Okay, let's look at it. Well, the famous one is Lucy. There are other specimens, not as complete as Lucy. These are the bones that were found in Lucy. And she was scheduled to spend 6 years in America going to 10 different museums being on display. Many museums refused to even accept the exhibit. They said they were putting this rare skeleton in too much danger to bring it over. So a lot of museums boycotted, including some of our major museums in the country. But they brought her over, and there were enough museums to at least show her. The whole show was called Lucy's Legacy, Hidden Treasures of Ethiopia, and it cost you $25 to venerate ape bones. From Houston, she went to Seattle. But before we go on to Seattle, let's look what they had at Houston. I got on their website. I knew the teachers were going to be bringing children through in the grade schools by the thousands, so I kind of wanted to know, what are they telling the teachers? So there was a place called the pre-field trip, post-field trip, Lucy and Anthropology for the elementary school. And this is what the teachers were told. First of all, this was not for the students, this was just for the teachers. For many years, Lucy was thought to be a direct human ancestor, but we now see her as belonging to a separate group of hominids from those that became our species. What? What do you know so far? She's not your relative. Isn't this what it's saying here, basically? Okay, look at the next sentence. This says, you're going to blow you away. Lucy remains the benchmark by which all other discoveries are judged. So it's not your relative, but it's the gold standard of all the ape men. This is as good as it gets. Man alive, were they in trouble or what with Lucy? In fact, we built our Lucy display. It took 2 years to build it, and I was just worried sick during the whole 2 years that they were going to just throw Lucy out. The evidence is so dreadful. And we'd be sitting with a white elephant, and nobody believes in it anymore, and we got a $100,000 exhibit. But I should have known, evolutionists never throw anything away. They haven't thrown the recapitulation myth away. I mean, they just keep everything. So anyway, what do the little kids get in the elementary school? This is where the science comes in. You'll see where your tax dollars are going. And you'll see why you have to be an evolutionist to be, according to Bill Nye, the science guy, you have to be an evolutionist to do almost anything, be an engineer or even a stand-up comic, which is what he spent a good part of his career doing. Here's what it said on the website for the teachers. The big question addressed with the kids is, when and why did our ancestors start walking upright? Notice no child is given the opportunity to discuss, did we have ancestors that didn't walk upright? Let's just assume. We're not going there. We're not going to allow that kind of discussion. Any child that brings it up, So when and why did our ancestors start walking upright? Okay, here's where the science comes in. I hope you can follow. It gets pretty deep. Put the students in groups of 2. Number each student 1 or 2. I'm not going too fast, am I? I didn't think so, no. Ask student number 1 to put his hands on the floor and walk on all 4 limbs around the classroom. So you got the picture, student number 1 on all 4s round and round the classroom. For a teacher's website, the instructions aren't very clear, but I gather student number 2 got to walk on 2 legs, probably following after student number 1, watching him struggle on the floor on 4 limbs. Now, why did they do that? Because this is hard science. This is experimental science. When you get all done, presumably when number 2 collapses in pain on the floor, you are then to discuss with your partner, would you rather walk on 2 legs or 4? This is closely related to the question, would you like a sharp stick in the eye? I mean, and then here's the real kicker here. Why do you think apes began walking on 2 legs? Can't you just imagine student number 2? Man, it really hurts walking on all 4. Well, there's your answer right there. It really hurt walking on 4. That's why they got up on 2. This you can teach. You can't teach creation. You can't even be critical of this. They even forbid the scientific criticism because they say until you get to college, a teacher's not qualified to disagree with the authorities in the textbooks and what have you. That's a legal decision. Well, there she is again. Lucy was discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, confidently dated at 3 million years, but her dates have gone all over the page, just current reading on that. They say the bones are 40% complete. Do the math. There's 207 bones in Lucy's skeleton, typical of a primate, and they have found about 47 bones. Make it 20%, you're closer. She's lacking most of the foot bones and hand bones, fingers, and well, 1 finger. But there are other specimens believed to be Australopithecus afarensis that include these bones. There's a whole group of about 16 called a first family. So this is the skeleton. In St. Louis, they made this model. So we made our model, they made their model. Remember, Lucy's about 3 foot 1 inch tall, so don't get the feeling that this is a 5 footer or anything like that. They usually make her that tall, but really, the creature, according to the bones, are about a little over 3 feet. The head is clearly ape-like, but from the neck on down, it's absolutely human. The trunks, breasts, genitalia, arms, hands, legs, feet, posture, gait, and pensive gaze. She's obviously had model training. She knows that if you point the toe, it extends the leg. And look at those legs. You ever see an ape with the legs like that? There's few enough ladies with legs like that. You have legs like that, you shave them, you could be in one of these Hanes stocking ads or something. But isn't it sad? Absolutely human till you get to the neck and then an ape head. Oh, bummer, right at the last moment. And look, do you have any idea what she's doing? She's thinking. You see, again, the artist conveys something that's not there in the fossils, but she's deep in thought. I've kind of figured she's saying something like, I don't have a thing to wear, but could be wrong in that. And look at those hand bones. You could in the fingers, you could play classical guitar, keyboard, absolutely human hands. Fingers a little longer than average, but human hands. Oh, and look at the whites in the eyes, see? This is standard. You won't find an ape man doesn't have a white sclera. Not in an evolution museum. Before this statue was made, or this model in St. Louis, Stern and Sussman, who are evolutionists, published a paper in the American Journal of Anthropology in which they showed Lucy had highly curved fingers capable of tree-dwelling primates. So in other words, she had meat hooks out here. Suspensory adapted, curved. Another line of evidence that she was suspensory adapted is the shoulder. If you lift your arm, you really can't go any higher than this joint. It won't allow it. And it's called the glenoid fossa, because it's like a glen, a shallow thing. You think, wait a minute, I can lift my arm up here. Anything higher than this, the muscles on your back here have to rotate the scapula. And you can feel this. Have somebody raise their arm. You put your fingers, this bone is close to the skin, the spine of the scapula. Put your fingers in there, you won't feel the thing up to here, but from here on up, you'll feel it start to turn. So tree-dwelling creatures have an up-tilted glenoid fossa. So their arms can be way up here before the muscles have to start rotating the scapula. Lucy has the up-tilted glenoid fossa. She has hook-like fingers. I mean, is it starting to maybe suggest been in a tree once in a while? This was really the killer. Richmond and Strait in Nature of 2000, March 23, 2000, said Lucy had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. We actually cite this reference in our exhibit. So if somebody gets all upset, as they are over our putting Lucy knuckle walking instead of Marine drill sergeant posture, take a look. What do you think? This is not a creationist. What are they seeing to indicate knuckle walking? If you extend the hand like this, the carpal bones, these little bones in the wrist, they kind of group or compact together, and it locks the wrist so you can support the weight of the knuckles. If you tried to walk on your knuckles, you'd very quickly be down on your hands. Couldn't support the weight in the knuckle. We lock our knees, by the way. You know, when you stand at attention, you kind of give it that extra, like that. And once you're in that position, you can stand for 2 or 3 hours until some rascal comes along and clips you right behind the knees. They unset the lock. The lock is really achieved by a muscle in the back of the knee, back here, that goes diagonally across, and it rotates just a couple degrees, and that sets the lock. So we have locking knees, whereas Lucy has no locking knees, she has locking wrists. Once again, what we'd expect from an ape. So our Lucy is knuckle walking. Hope you've all had a chance to see her. And we believe this is a much closer representation of what she might have looked like than certainly the St. Louis exhibit. And then look at the feet they put on Lucy. You ever see feet like that? Kick off a shoe, you'll see feet like that. And hairy, but human feet. What do we know for sure? She didn't have human feet. Again, Stern and Sussman show curved toes, big toe standing out, heavily muscled foot. So people are just ignoring the evidence. They always put human feet on Lucy. They ignore the bones we have. They just go ahead and put human feet on. The brown are the original bones. The white is their interpretation. They just go ahead and put human feet on. Why? Look, in 1996, they finally get the hands right. It took all those years to get them to finally put the hands that we knew were there with the curved fingers, but still the human feet. They're there because the Laetoli footprints found by Mary Leakey actually a year before they found Lucy. And these footprints represent at least 2 individuals. You see left-right stride, and this goes on for 73 feet. So this is not just an occasional footprint we're looking at here. And next to it is a smaller individual who obviously is increasing their stride to keep up with the bigger individual. I heard Mary Leakey give a lecture on this at Washington University shortly after she discovered it. And she said in her lecture that, this is just amazing that these feet would be identical to the appearance of human feet. In fact, one of the evolutionists at the time, Tim White, who was an expert on fossil feet, says any child looking at it would know that it was just like what they saw on the beach. I mean, clearly human. With a well-developed arch, I mean, look at this foot. Well-developed arch here, toe goes straight ahead, doesn't splay out. The smaller toes cling to the ground. And even the stride, we have a unique stride. The heel hits first, the weight goes out to the little toe, comes across, you push off with the big toe. There's no other creature that walks that way. So they got all this evidence. So I had the chutzpah to ask Mary Leakey personally, since they're virtually identical to human footprints, why not consider the possibility that they're human footprints? And in that tone of voice that the English reserve in teaching and talking to colonists, she said, ooh, but surely you must know there were no humans around 3 million years ago. Well, settles that. I don't care if they find a catty coupe de ville down here, there were no humans around. I get asked all the time, how come we don't find human fossils in old strata? We do. You see what happens to them? They either say they're not human or it's not that old. If you're confused, here's an ape foot and a human foot. You can sort things out on your own. Finally, well, not finally, but penultimately, humans are knock-kneed. If you look at Yorick here, put his feet together, you see how the femurs converge? So we're knock-kneed. That's good. If our legs were perfectly straight, our feet would be as far apart as our hips. And then as soon as you started to walk, you'd fall in that direction. So most apes have straight legs. And you say, well, then why don't they fall down? Well, they throw the weight over the planted foot. So when they lift their left foot, they throw their weight over this one. When they lift their right foot, they throw the weight over this one. See if this looks familiar to you. That's an ape walk. That's one of two reasons they walk that way. And in humans, it's about 8 degrees. They claim in Lucy it's up to 15. So the human is 9, whereas a gorilla is 0, straight-legged chimp is 0. But here's where you have to learn to be critical. You need to ask the teacher, Miss Jones, are there any apes that have a carrying angle? Hey, glad you asked. The orangutan has 9 degrees, just like the human. The spider monkey has 9 degrees. Nobody says they're becoming human, nor do they walk like a human. What are they doing with this carrying angle? They're walking on limbs and trees. They're tight wire walkers. I'll give you a first lesson in tight wire walking. You want to keep your feet together, right? Do not try like this. This is not going to work. So the carrying angle doesn't prove anything. Finally, Lucy's hips. You cannot walk like a human with ape hips. These are ape hips. What's the difference? Well, here's our chimp that we have in our display case up there. Notice the iliac blades, which are these things here. They're kind of under your belt here. The iliac blades go straight out on each side. There's a very important muscle attached to that blade that goes to this bump called the greater trochanter. That's this bump right here. On a chimp, that muscle's running down the back, isn't it? And what it does is a chimp has a posture, all apes have a posture, that's bent forward and bent at the knees. Their problem is falling on their face, and this gluteus medius muscle pulls them back by extending at the hip. Humans have the same type of hip, same muscle called the gluteus medius, but we use it in a very different way. Let me show you. This is the human hip. And the iliac blades curve around. I always liken it to ape hips are like scooter handlebars, and human hips are like tricycle handlebars that come out like this, so you can drive your tricycle like this, steer. Now, what's important is the gluteus medius attaches right here where you see this, the red and blue is where muscles attach. Attaches right here and goes down to the greater trochanter. If this muscle contracts, look what happens. It abducts the leg. So if I exercise my gluteus medius, this happens. Now, we don't do this kind of thing too often in life unless there's a dance I'm not familiar with. But what we do is every time we lift our left leg, our left hip ought to collapse because these are ball socket joints. You got a ball socket joint here, a ball socket joint here, lift this leg, this is going down. It would, except the gluteus medius on the right contracts, and instead of abducting your leg, it keeps your hips level. When I lift my right leg, then the left gluteus medius contracts. And so our ability to walk without waddling from side to side is based on having the gluteus medius in this configuration. It does not extend like it does in an ape. So the big question is, you can't walk like a human unless you have hips like that. What kind of hips does Lucy have? And the hips are ape hips. Well, I've pretty much told you what you need to know from an anatomical view that Lucy is another ape. Why is this important? Probably seen this figure before. If we have Adam in our past, and he's our ancestor, then our absolutes come from God, and God sets the rules. Huh? We're accountable to him, basically. Whereas we have ape in our past, all morality becomes relative, and man sets the rules. Two very different views. And these have real implications. Have you heard of Jeffrey Dahmer? He engaged in somewhat questionable behavior. He ate people. I saw this guy when he had this interview with Stone Phillips on TV. He was absolutely rational. He was a very bright, very articulate young man. Most mothers would be just delighted if their daughter were to date somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, except he ate people, killed them. And look what he said on the Stone Phillips Dateline NBC, November 29, 1994. If a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. When we died, that's it, nothing. Man, alive. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't think evolution utterly destroyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. I left my grandkids that lived 10 minutes away in St. Louis, and my daughter and her husband. They used to come over and swim in the pool and what have you. Left them all behind, came here because it's that important to me. It's that important to just blow the whistle. Hey, thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate it.